Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the zero-noise application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Invicti, AppSec with zero noise. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti.
Hi folks, I'm Adrian Sanabria, the host of Enterprise Security Weekly. Every week, we interview the most interesting folks we can find talking about the most pressing cybersecurity issues and challenges facing the enterprise today. Myself and my co-hosts have each been in the industry for decades, long enough to see the patterns in the industry and explore where trends are going. In addition to enterprise challenges, we also follow the vendor space, the most interesting security startups emerging, technology and product trends, all the most interesting funding and acquisition announcements. Finally, we love to discuss the latest trends in tech and how they'll impact cybersecurity. If you're wondering how the latest in AI, quantum computing, cloud, and DevOps is going to impact security a few years down the road, you should follow the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Eve Mailer from ForgeRock about identity in cars, leaving passwords in the dust, and the trust and safety aspects that APIs on wheels require. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, one announcement. Join us at an upcoming official cybersecurity summit in a city near you. This series of one-day invitation-only executive-level conferences are designed to educate senior cyber professionals on the latest threat landscape. We are pleased to offer our listeners $100 off admission when you register with code SECWEEK23. Visit securityweekly.com/cybersecurity summit to learn more and register today. The other thing you could be doing today is turning on some music as you're driving in your car. I had, of course, Cars by Gary Newman playing in the back of my head the entire conversation we just had with Eve there, John. I'm curious, what song about driving or what song about cars, Mike, is one of your favorites or gets stuck in your head?
So I've got two ways I can go on this, Mike. There's songs about cars driving fast, and then there's songs to play when you're driving fast, or if you want to drive fast.
Let's hear both.
I'll go through a second one. That's my favorite. It'd be interesting to see. I think for our listeners know we're both into sort of the ooch type thing, but our tastes sort of differ a little bit. But let's see. I'll start off with two soundtracks. The Wipeout XL, the video game, came out in 1996. Pretty much every track on there is good to drive fast to because the video game is about driving fast. MTV's AMP, for those who remember those in 1997, had a bunch of really great stuff on it. But individual songs, Song 2 by Blur. I'm not a big Blur fan, but like you put that song on and like my right foot goes towards the floor. And then I'll do one more, The Prodigy from 2018, Time Bomb Zone. Again, anything from The Prodigy is pretty amazing, but I'll start with those. How about you?
Yeah, that Prodigy album is amazing too. So go get that if you don't know it. I'm going to throw in, there's some classics. Get Out of My Dreams, Get Into My Car. There's Billy Ocean, Little Red Corvette, of course, from Prince. Those are probably the most predictable. I'll throw in some synthwave, which everybody, you should listen to the Drive soundtrack. And yes, Night Call by Kavinsky is just a great driving song. But I'll also throw in a pretty good, a song that goes bop, My DeLorean by Tom Kopp, 1983, and Primo the Alien. I think I might have mentioned that on a past episode as well a couple years ago. But My DeLorean is a pretty fun one. So everyone go download some music while John and I talk about some AppSec news. So yeah, I guess the other reason we're here, John, is to talk about things that have go fast, turn left. I'm not sure that's the Indy 500 kind of explanation or description. I'm not sure how to bring that into the world of AppSec other than maybe we talk about 0 to 60 or just staying at 0. Zenbleed register leak. That's my rough way to segue into this, talking about zeros. Tell us about this. You caught this before I did.
This is a fun one. And real quick on the last topic, one of the things when I obviously spent too much time over the weekend thinking about car songs. If folks are interested and they sort of give us like a little bit of like feedback, maybe I'll throw that into like a playlist of my favorite drive fast songs because there's a lot more. But anyways, Zenbleed. This came out, I think it was last Monday, either before or right after we got off air.
Exactly.
Okay. But a comment quickly to our researchers out there. This is sort of like releasing something right at the end of Black Hat, guys, you have to like do it before Monday morning when we're recording so we can actually talk about this in the show and be like the first people out there. This was it's an interesting one. It's a good one in that it is very easy for folks to, compromise. So what we're talking about here, there is a vulnerability in a collection of AMDs into CPUs, where this is, again, one of our speculative execution vulnerabilities. So what that means, for the quick recap for folks out there, the way you make a CPU faster, first you have faster clock rates, and you go to multi-pipelines so you can do multiple things at once. And then after that, you have to figure out you can only do so many of those. So how do you start guessing what's the next thing the person or the program wants to do? And so that's what speculative execution is, right? You have an if test, and then instead of just running one down one, you go down both ways, and then by the time they need it, you got the answer. The problem with some AMD CPUs is, in this particular case, is when you go down that second path, which is not used, say you do an if test, true or false, and it turns true, but you've done the calculation on the false, you now have to go back and clean up your little mess which you made, right? So any register settings, any memory stuff going on, all that type of stuff has to be sort of cleaned up and returned to normal. And I believe there's something and I'm doing this off memory, so excuse me, there's something in there from AMD which allows you to zero those out quickly. But it turns out there's a problem with that. And the result is some stuff gets left behind in memory, so you have information leakage. And the problem with this now is this is done in ring 0. I know ring 0 is not its thing, but I still think of ring 0. It's done in the core of your CPU, which means, I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's pretty damning from them themselves. This is vulnerable for processes. It's either inter-process, cross-process, or even cross a virtualized hypervisor, virtualized machines within a CPU, which means that happens anywhere. And, in a modern day of cloud and in Kubernetes and all these different types of things, this is a pretty bad vulnerability. So that's the state of it. The one thing I'll say and then shut up, Mike, is it looks like when AMD submitted patches for the Linux kernel, there's just two ways you can deal with this. You can either apply a microcode patch, which is out for some CPUs, or you can turn what's called a chicken bit on. And really what a chicken bit is, it's a fun generic name for a setting on your system which allows disabling of that speculative execution. I believe it is in this case. But the other version of actually patching the microcode into your CPU and fixing this, they haven't done it for a whole CPU family. So they've done it for some of them, but they haven't done it for others. And I can't remember which is which. If you go, I think I've got a link in here in the notes. You can go drill down in there and see which is it. And this is specifically talking about Linux. But yes, that's sort of the state of things. The latest I've heard on it. It made people have a not great week.
Not great week, but a kind of great week for the security researcher side of the house and those who enjoy fuzzing. Because one of the neat things about this is that Tavis Ormandy describes fuzz. They used a fuzzer to discover this and developed a bit of a new approach called an Oracle serialization, which is essentially take those instructions and then have one that you would normally execute and have another one that's more atomic in the sense of disable the speculative execution, have memory fences around it. And then ideally, both of these two paths of execution should produce the same output, whether or not speculative execution is there or not. But what they saw was that the fuzzer said, oh, look, there's a difference.
Something's different.
And this difference suddenly becomes, that looks interesting, and which is one of a favorite phrase, perhaps, of security researchers. So you dive in to see what looks interesting, and you discover a wonderful bug like this that gives people rough weekends. So there's a great addendum, I would say, that the approach that was used to find this is possibly going to be generalized to identify other future bugs as well.
Yeah, that whole exactly took the words right out of my mouth. The whole man, guys, think about it. You're fuzzing a CPU. This isn't fuzzing a program or something running on it. It's like, how do you fuzz the CPU itself as a, not the CPU manufacturer? It's a pretty neat bit of work. I mean, that whole thing we could probably talk about for a show by itself. It's pretty neat what they're able to do there, and I suspect we're just seeing the tip of it.
Just the tip. And now, in terms of security tips, we've got one about not over-relying on CVSS. I think we can tie this to Now, there's no causal relationship here, but not over relying on CVSS. And there's also a drop in 0 days, and I think there's some themes we can pull out of this. But you hit the CVSS first, John. Why don't you start us off?
Definitely. So this is an article. It links out to a few different things, but it's sort of a good place for people to start thinking about this. And as I said, Mike wanted to show you when I was talking with Akira, I happen to like CVSS. I think for a lot of use cases, it does a great job. One of the jobs which it's not really great at is if you're a relatively large organization, you've got tens of thousands of vulnerabilities and you're trying to sort them off CVSS, that's useless. And that's, I think, why a lot of people sort of give it, not a great look. So what this article talks through is two other things. CISA's KEV, which is known exploited vulnerability, a database of known exploited vulnerabilities out there. So in other words, how can you prioritize what you're trying to fix, right? If you can see, okay, are people actually hacking and doing something with this? Okay, let's start there. And then the second thing they're focusing on is EPSS, which my silly brain has forgotten what it means off the top of my head, Exploit Prediction Scoring System, which came out of first. So it's basically looking, how can you use different metrics to actually figure out where do you start your day? There's a lot of vendors out there which specialize in this type of thing. We've had Phoenix Security on here before. That's one of the things they work on. There's some other ones out there as well. I think this article mentions, there's a few other ones out there. I don't see a link in here. That's a bummer. But there's a bunch of folks, Resilient, excuse me. And the long and short of it, Mike, is how can we use different metrics and different databases out there to make someone's life easier to figure out where do you start that? So this article gives some people something to think about.
It does. And I wouldn't even necessarily say begrudging. I do enjoy CVSS as well, but just that it has a very specific time and place.
Yes.
And where it starts to fail is, as you said, that volume of vulnerability. So the CISA's KEV seems helpful to say, here are just the ones that are being exploited. Go deal with these. Another way that security strategies can possibly go sideways is just saying, well, how do we deal with 0 days? And over-indexing on a concern or worry about 0 days is possibly another one of my pet peeves. And here's an interesting article from Google's threat analysis group that quotes Maddie Stone, who we would love to get an interview here. So Maddie, or if Maddie's friends are listening, please let her know. We want to bring her on. But they're saying that they've seen an actual drop in 0 days being used in the wild. In other words, threat actor groups, APTs, whatever your naming convention desire is, that they've gone down. Now, I think she gives some very informed and insightful reasons why. There's no one reason for this. So we can't necessarily say that AppSec has, suddenly gotten better, even though we want to be progressing in that way. It could also be just you don't need 0 days when there are credentials that are easily stolen. Not everybody is caught up to speed with what Eve was talking about. Let's leave those passwords in the dust and move on to passkeys or in WebAuthn and so on. So it's definitely a complex topic, but I think for me, if you are only worried about if you're worried about 0 days, hopefully you have the maturity of a vulnerability management program and you have the maturity of a proactive controls program, such as deploying FIDO2, deploying WebAuthn, having considered passing an asset inventory before you've gotten to that point about the scary 0 days. So that was my little bit of soapbox for the day. Anything here that surprised you about this or that stood out for you about this, John?
It makes me do what I just did. I think there's I think it's
sigh.
Yeah, well, not so much long side as it's that sort of moment of what's going on here, a little bit of head scratching. I suspect also there's some factors in there around malcreants are starting to pay more for those vulnerabilities, so they're keeping them either like the vendors which are making hacking software, NSO comes to mind, or some of the others. Maybe they're paying more. I don't know that for sure, just a guess. Or maybe there's. I don't think there's less of these things being found. I'm a little too cynical to believe that. But yeah, right. It's again. I think what's interesting for probably the majority of our listeners is the O day is not the problem, right? It's everything else that's out there. It's like if your main concern in life is being hit by a 0 day. Yeah, that'll hit you, right? And that's a bad thing. But there's probably your focus is probably a little bit broader than just that. So keep on doing what you're doing, folks.
Keep on doing what you're doing. And there, as you made a very important distinction there. There's a difference between discovering 0 days and getting them patched versus them being used in exploit campaigns, which is also ties into that CIS's known exploited vulnerabilities, the KEV database. I want to drive us over, shift lanes into an article that sounds like, well, duh, but also maybe this will get the long sigh out of you. The title of the blog is Discovering That Your Bluetooth Car Battery Monitor is Siphoning Up Your Location Data. And this is precise location data as well. So now for me, it is topical. Obviously, we just talked about Eve and cars and car security. It also was just updated this past week, saying that the the app developer removed this precise location tracking. But for me, if you check out part 2 of this article, it's just a really nice walkthrough about reverse engineering an Android app. So it talks about Frida, talks about JDX, a couple other just techniques, way to deobfuscate, look at the function names. It even uses a chat GPT to confirm what the behavior of a particular, a anonymously named function. So I thought that was a little bit interesting, and it was kind of a helpful use. So this is more of just check it out if you want to do more Android app reverse engineering and just want to get started repeating this type of work, following along with the author when they're well-written articles like this can be really helpful.
Yeah. I think one of the cases where I really like long posts or multi-part posts is something like this, where they're sort of not so much walking you through how to do this, but walking you through how they did this. And there's a lot of, how would I say, plate. I think to a newbie at least, there's a lot of plate juggling which has to happen to do hardware hacking, right? There's all these things which you have to sort of get right in the right place. But even from like that first quick glance of like, yeah, you put a Bluetooth car battery monitor on and suddenly someone's tracking your location. But with you, the second and third parts really tickled me. The concept of being able to sort of, reverse the not just the overall protocol, but Bluetooth low energy, easy for me to say. And then sort of walking through how they're doing that. This looks like C, but that must be C++. But anyways, where I wanted to go with this was, as I was mentioning to Mike off air, there's another book out there. So we covered and fawned over, at least I fawned over a little bit, the Hardware Hacking Handbook, written by Van Wodenberg and Colin O'Flynn, which came out a few years ago. But what came out probably 6 or 10 months before that, I picked up and I've been reading over the weekend, is the Practical Hardware Pen Testing book by Jean-Georges Vallée. And excuse me if I'm killing your name. But it's slightly more academic. But really where I mentioned this is if folks want to get into this hardware space, we're always talking about it, but how do you get into it, right? And both these books sort of walk you through how you build a lab, what parts you need. And they both do actually sort of, if you have a low budget, medium budget, or if you're a company. So they sort of give you a sense of like, how do you get into this cheap and start playing with this stuff? And like, the hardware, what's the name again? The Practical Hardware Pen Testing book actually uses a Furby as an example, right? So I'm always about how can you like get something and sort of, play with something in your hands. And this book, again, also has like a quiz at the end of each chapter. So it sort of helps you, no one's grading you, right? But it lets you think, do you actually learn what's going on here? Versus the Hardware Hacking Handbook is a lot more about at least to me, more hardcore things about power glitching and things like that. But for those of our listeners who are interested, both really great books. I'll add the other one into our show notes since we didn't cover it before.
No, and let's actually throw a third book in there. We've got an article from Trail of Bits announcing their testing handbook. And they've got only a single chapter up, but it's a nice chapter on SemGrep. Everybody seems to love SemGrep. It's the fun tool to crawl an AST and do pattern matching on ASTs, which is very powerful. But what was nice about this handbook is that I opened up the link and I was like, oh, is this just really a list of bullet points? That's not really a chapter, but you get into the advanced usage as well as some like continuous integration. Basically, rather than how to use it, just use this as a one-off CLI tool, here's how to put it into your ecosystem. So it keeps on going. And of course, if you want to dive more, has a wonderful list of additional resources. So you can very easily do a very long, deep dive into SemGrep. So seeing this and knowing the reputation for Trail of Bits, hoping to see many, many more chapters come out, hopefully sooner than later, in the matter of a couple of weeks rather than a couple of months.
Yeah. Isn't that funny? I had the exact same reaction when I hit that link. The first page for the chapter, folks, it's barely 2 browser screens long. You're like,
right.
That's it? And then you suddenly notice there's and this is sort of the way we're sort of trained to expect something, scroll. But the other sort of subsections are great. What I really liked was the additional resources and the list of links which are linking out to. And I suspect that'll keep you going for quite a while besides just getting going in SemGrep. So I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of what comes out next.
Yeah, and then on a theme, let's do a quick wrap up of some security research and tools before we get to something more fun to talk about. That's a teaser and foreshadowing. But we talked last week, John, about the 5 tools for cloud security, and they seemed just kind of a shrug. So I threw in the interest of being constructive criticism, I threw in a tool here from NCC Group's Scout Suite. It's a pretty old tool that's been around for a while. It does have a little bit of a kind of a freemium aspect. It's it's a vendor-driven tool, but that's just more of I say as awareness rather than a judgment of it. But I would throw that onto folks' toolboxes. It's a cloud configuration scanner that pretty easy to use. It applies to most of the major cloud providers. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or we move on to something else.
No, I looked at this a year or two ago in my last startup when we were looking for some sort of tool to help us import from the clouds, and I didn't use it. I don't know why. I don't know if the output wasn't machine readable or if I wasn't. Maybe it was too wide or something. I mean, I know it's a good tool. I think coming out of NCC is good. But I haven't got my hands dirty with it yet, so I'll wait for a feedback from our listeners.
There is also some other security research about a Keypass audit report. So we've highlighted audit reports in the past because they're just great ways to learn about, it's nice to see the transparency. We want to encourage that. I think with all of the audit reports recently, I've been loving, been wishing for more of the here is how we did the audits, or sort of the techniques, which admittedly is a little bit of the secret sauce, if you will, of a lot of these pen testing companies, but it's not that secret. Everybody pretty much takes the same approaches. And the reason I would love to see that is they're great education, learning. If you're starting to get into this area, seeing how other people do this type of audit can be helpful, especially since this is focusing on, crypto protection, cryptographic protection. Let me be sure I'm clear here. But clearly you wanted to talk about this, so let me get out of the way, and why don't you pass on the left and
we take
tell us
our
about
security
this,
seriously. Yeah, so this popped up on my radar last week, and I'm trying to find the other reason. I can't. So part of the reason it's popped on my radar is I was going down a rat hole thinking about how do you score a password, right? We've seen these in a browser or maybe different applications. Like as you type your characters, it goes from green to yellow to red, and ooh, strong password.
Right.
And different systems, sometimes it's just if you go from 10 to 13 characters. Sometimes if you add the exclamation point, sometimes it's some other stupid thing, right? So we were talking about password rotation in the last half and the NIST standards, and it's that same sort of idea. But when I was going through that, there was an algorithm which Keypass uses to sort of both, they show you, I guess, if you're using that password manager, which one of your passwords are weak, but there's also, it's sort of neat, they've got in their default searches, which they have, so Keypass, for those who don't know, is a open source password manager database type thing, cross-platform, all those good things. But there's a default search, you can click on it, it shows you all your I'll say accounts, all your password entries that have a weak password on them. But as I was going through all that type of thing, I found this blog about, they did an analysis a few months ago. And one of the things I liked in it is it's down near the end on page 29. So the first thing, for some of us will notice, this was obviously written in LaTeX. If people want to see a document which was written in LaTeX, this is it, and it'll give you that sort of sense. It just has that feel to it. If you're not looking at Mike's resume. But the second thing, anyways, on page 29, there's a list of recommendations to Keypass users, right? So just think about that for a second, that they're putting this into an audit report. So they're expecting the password nerds, security nerds, to go and read this document, which is sort of a bit of a statement by itself. But it sort of goes through some, common things, but again, useful. But the sort of top of mind on it, the first thing they hit is the strength of that password. This matters for any password database, commercial or not. The strength of that password, which you have to get into your password database, if the entropy on that stupid thing is fairly low, the whole game's over, right? So I think it's a very obvious thing, but still for any of our listeners to sort of keep that in mind, right? It's the last thing you want to do every time you enter your password safe is type 20, 30 characters. So, okay, do you use some sort of like a YubiKey or something like that, some sort of a 2FA device? And Keypass supports a bunch of these, but that's sort of the moment of thought here for me is people always ask me what password manager I use, and it doesn't matter, but how strong is the manager itself, and then how strong is the password you're using for that type of thing. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, and I think that is where we haven't, obviously we're talking about passwords because we are not yet in the fully passwordless world, despite the work Microsoft has been pushing on this, Apple obviously with Passkey. I think the one thing I'd add here is that it'd be wonderful when we can get away from the conversation of how strong is this password in the sense of how resistant is it to the brute force dictionary attack, et cetera. Because with WebAuthn, for example, and passkeys, if your public key, if the server is popped, the attacker now has a list of your public keys for all the victims, but that's essentially useless to them. As opposed to if they have the hashed, salted, sometimes not even salted, password database, that's more useful to them to get into that account. So this is why I will continue to repeat FIDO2, WebAuthn, and whenever possible.
I didn't. One of our questions for Eve when we bring her back on is when can cars be used for that second factor authentication from our password safe?
Yes. Well, Eve is going to be at, InfoSec World, giving a presentation, a talk. So as a reminder, listeners, go track her down and ask those questions of her. But she's also clearly, we had a great time chatting with her, clearly a well-practiced public speaker. John, I think you have, given some presentations in the past. I've given some presentations in the past. And we have a great article here from Phil Venables about recommendations for a first-time public speaker. Or honestly, even if you've done a lot of public speaking and are still uncomfortable with it or want to improve how you do that public speaking, because you can still be a practiced public speaker giving very boring monotone presentations that make people snooze and fall asleep. And ain't nobody got time for that.
No.
So,
well, go ahead. One of the tips for
I was going to say, out of the gate, I was just setting up yet another pole position reference here to fill up the metaphors for this episode, John. So you've got pole position.
Nice.
Off.
Thank you. Now I just need to keep it for the win. I wouldn't call this tips. I think if you're going to get on a small stage or a large stage or talk to more than 2 of your friends, you need to be doing, I think, pretty much all of this. I think it's a good list. I seem to be saying that a lot, but every single thing he does, telling stories, preparation, and let's be very clear, folks. You can tell there's been 2 times I've been host on this podcast. One time I prepared, one time I prepared both times, one time I practiced, one time I didn't. You can tell the difference. And that's the same with any of my talks, right? It's you have to practice, you have to do the stuff. Even if you know it inside out, you got to have those words come out of your mouth and rehearse. Dealing with nerves and anxiety, you just get used to that. That one, there's different tricks. Some you'll cover on a podcast, some you won't. But it's everything in here is really great. Delivery tips. Yeah, don't read slides. Please don't read slides. Don't have words in your slides. I tell so many people this, even in like startup pitching, don't give me a slide filled with words. No, talk to me. Don't assume people are smart. Demos, everything. The whole list is great. Yeah, demos, don't do a live demo is my thing. I mean, you're praying to demo gods at that point. Plus you're on stage, plus you're nervous and everything goes downhill quickly. Especially... Yeah, this is a good list. I know Phil does large stage. Yeah, live TV. This podcast is one thing. Folks who haven't experienced it, once someone puts a camera and a light at you, everything changes. But anyways, there's a lot of really great stuff in here. So if you're even thinking about it, you should save this, print it out, memorize it, and then before you give a talk, go back over it again.
Absolutely, and I agree. This is it's a nice long article that is filled with that just is resonated for me every time, every paragraph I was reading through. One of the things I'd also highlight, just point something different that you did. I do love the tell a story. That is one of my go-to things. Have a beginning, middle, and end. Which, if you repeat that too much, it starts to sound cliche. But it really just means tell something that has, give a reason. Here's the problem. Here's the solution. Or here's why. What we learned from it. Have a learning experience through the end. But also have it something that's relevant to your audience, which ties into the preparation. And I like how he makes the distinction between preparation and rehearsal, because and I'll quote from this that this is also a pet peeve of mine is if somebody gets on stage and says, "I didn't have time to prepare anything for this, but here's a few thoughts because I'm a luminary." It's like you're rambling, you're incoherent, you're not making a point, it's a little bit of narcissism because I like the sound of their own voice. And be respectful of the audience. In other words, find something that also resonates with them. Tell a story that is going to help them, educate them. Even when we're talking about the identities in car security, hopefully we threw in something that is going to help with our listeners here, obviously with AppSec. And, clearly, one of my techniques listeners have picked up is to pull in a little bit of a pop culture reference or just something that everybody can like. Everybody has their favorite driving song, so it's a little way to keep attention, but not dominate it just by going off on random tangents. And I think the other. Oh, go ahead.
Real quick, you need to make it interesting for two different parties. You need to make it interesting for yourself, so you're actually because and I'll go give you an example, but like if I'm interested in something, it totally comes through. Like my eyes sparkle. I'm more interested. There's more jokes. Like I'm more energetic, right? It's talking about this particular subject versus talking about sunbathing. I'm probably not going to be quite as you get the idea. Sorry to paint that picture. But the second thing is you need to be able to however you do it, engage those listeners. Thinking back from some of my talks over the last few years, I haven't given as many as I used to, but like there was one where I sort of gave this story about myself and my wife going on vacation somewhere, and like it was the talk was being given in Europe, so it was at a Formula One race in Europe, and that really connected with people. Like it's like, how can you connect with folks, like even if it's outside the particular topic you're on? But anyways, we've talked about this one enough, and I'm rambling. So one of the things I shouldn't do as a good public speaker is ramble. So I'm now going to be quiet.
I will just, in the spirit of showing that, I've made mistakes in the past as well. Definitely, I have old slides that are just bullet points that I would go and completely never have a bullet point ever again. I would have more of images. Another thing is also slowing down. And that's possibly one of the most difficult things for any public speaker, including me as I do even as I do the intro. Sometimes I'll speed up, sometimes I'll slow down because timing is everything, but also just let the listeners, let the audience understand what you're saying too. Give them a moment to catch up, to let that point sink in. So I'm not going to anything about like studies say every 3,000 words you have to put in a joke that lasts for 20 seconds. I not going quite that silly, but just try to read the audience, which is sadly really tough in the world of Zoom and meetings. But it's a struggle.
That one's good and bad, right? So yeah, I'm horrible about talking fast. I probably do it on this show all the time, but like if I'm talking publicly, you'll see me just shut my mouth for a few seconds and just let people catch up. Reading the audience is good and bad though, because when you see that person get out of their chair and walk out when you're doing your talk, that can
be demotivating.
And I understand there's reasons people do it, but anyways, yeah, we can do a whole separate podcast on this one, I think.
And it's summer conference time coming up, so that's why this is also topical for everybody dropping into the Black Hat, DEF CON, all the B-sides, as well as I will mention. I think there's been comments before. Every day of the year has a B-sides or some local security meetup, which I think is great because those can offer chances to practice this type of experience, to gather this experience, both on talking as well as that. Telling a story, talking about like, this is a research I did. Here's a tool I created. Here's a problem I solved. and just having that practice of here is how I got other people to realize it, to understand it, to be entertained, whether it's a 15-minute or a 40-minute or even tough when you get into an hour. But we've got the checkered flag is waving on us, John. We're getting down to that time. So we've got maybe a handful of articles left. Is there one in particular maybe you want to take us out on?
Ooh. I have one favorite. Let me see if I can find. Yeah, no, I think we have to spend 30 seconds on this Huawei team manager.
Gotcha.
Arbitrary code execution. You found it, so I'm going to let you start with it.
Well, it's funny because I'm going to jump to the very end because this is, it was found back in 2019, so it's a bit old there, but there's a timelessness of the takeaways that DoyenSec threw in here in their conclusion that mostly I'll just to mostly just read is, while relying on signature validation for authenticating software components, you have to include that, any dynamically loaded code has to be part of that signature. And I think, honestly, that's kind of a good takeaway as we're talking about identity and over-the-air updates. We're talking about, when that conversation with Eve. So that resonated there. And the other part, speaking of Windows NT, when we design backwards compatibility mechanisms, we should assume that there may be older versions we want to abandon. And man, if Microsoft had abandoned the landman hash ages ago, so many Windows NT sysadmins would be in a much, much happier place these days.
Yes. Much easier said than done, but I'm with you.
That's why we're podcast hosts. Last thoughts for you on this one?
I was getting a really great giggle out of I missed that it was an old article, our old original, but still arbitrary code execution on the team manager of on a phone. It, for folks who want the punchline, it looks like it's doing some dynamic loading of some files as it loads that theme and renders that theme. So you're able to go through and standard dynamic loading type attack and put something in there, and you've got the phone. It's sort of bringing it back around circle. Is there a chance that someone at some point is going to try and do some sort of dynamic loading of something in a car, maybe for like your dashboard or your music or whatever else, or if you want plug-in support, or just a matter of time as we start? I think we're really on the tip of what we're starting to hear about these car things, just because there's so much tech in them. And if I go out and start hacking on my car in the garage and I break something, my wife, or as I also refer to her as management, is probably going to be having a discussion with me. So where we actually get to work on these things is a little bit different. But yeah, I think we'll be talking about that a lot more in the future.
We will. And I'll use that as a chance to ask listeners, who should we also be talking to? Because as you notice, John is definitely much more the expert on this than I am. But I like asking questions and learning from John as well as learning from our guests. So let us know who in the car hacking space we should chat with. And with that, I'm going to say thank you once again, John, for joining me. Our ride is here. We've got to take off. Thank you, listeners. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of cars, check out Turbo Killer by Carpenter Brute. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.